So this is Parashas Balak. I feel bad that we missed Chukas, but now we get to do Balak together. And before we get into the verses, we want to talk a little bit about why it's called Parashas Balak, about some of the unusual things about this Parasha, about the prophet Bilaam, about how some even argue that his prophecy was greater than Moshe Rabbeinu's. There's why is this passage even in the Torah when it's not even directly referring? There's no real reference to direct interactions with the Jewish people. In fact, when we were studying the Gemara, Baba Basra, earlier this week, it actually said that there was a special reference to it because it mentioned that Moshe Rabbeinu, it says in 14b, it says that Moshe Rabbeinu Kasav Sifro Uparshas Bilam. It says that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote his book, and in addition to writing his book, he also wrote the book he wrote his book, and in addition to that, he wrote Parashas Bilam. So when the Talmud refers to it, it doesn't actually doesn't call it Balak, but it calls it the passage of Bilam, which is unusual. And the reason why Rashi says, this is part of the whole Torah, so why does it need to mention it separately? So Rashi mentions here, Rashi says here, let me just quote it, it says, Nevuaso umoshlav, the prophecy and the parables, even though they were not part of the needs of Moshe and his Torah and his story, nevertheless he wrote it. Meaning to say, it contains, Rashi says specifically, it contains passages which are not directly related to Moshe Rabbeinu and his Torah. Just give me 1 second. I want to just get a different source to cite for you. Hold on. Here. So again, Rashi says explicitly that this passage, that the reason why it has to say that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote this passage is because even though Moshe wrote all of the 5 books of Moses, it's making the point, I'm just speaking generally speaking, it's making the point that there's something very, very different about this passage. That's, again, just to repeat what Rashi says, even though this passage is not necessary. It's not necessary for the needs of Moshe. I mean, to say this whole portion, Parashas Balak, is, so to speak, according to this Rashi, not even necessary for the Torah. That's Rashi's explanation. But before we go on to going through the text and the verses, the Shnei Luchos Abris, the author of the Rabbi Isaiah Horowitz, the 16th century, you can look it up, was very bothered by this explanation. And he writes, the Shla writes, Vitema. He says, this is a question. Is there even one letter in the Torah that is not part of the Torah? Of course, passage of Bilam is written in the Torah. If that's the case, why does it say Moshe Rabbeinu wrote his work at Kosav Sifro Uparshas Bilam? Moshe wrote the whole thing. Why does it need to mention Moshe wrote his Sefer, i.e. the 5 books of Torah and the Parasha of Bilam? Again, Rashi's explanation was that it's because this passage, this portion that we're studying, was not necessary for Moshe to tell his story. But the Shla does not like that explanation. And that which Rashi says, who says there's no need for this in the Torah of Moshe, the Shla writes, V'lo zachiti lahavin divrei harav peh kadosh. He said, I never merited to understand the words of the teacher here with his holy mouth. All of the stories, there are many stories in the Torah, like, for example, when Cain killed Abel, and similar stories that are not necessary for the Torah and for the chronology of the narrative of the Israelites. But the whole thing is the Torah of Hashem and is pure and perfect. As it states, Timnah was the concubine, but Timnah Aita Pilegesh, who Torat Hashem Kamo Shema Yisrael, which is the same power and holiness, just like the verse of the Shema. So we can't start saying, well, this passage, we didn't need it, so therefore it has to tell us that Moshe wrote it. The whole Torah is needed, just as much as the Shema is needed, so too every other verse is needed. So why was this thing singled out? And this is the question that the Shloah Kadosh asks about the explanation of Rashi. And so therefore, he explains that the intent of Rashi was that Moshe, this is the language of the Shloah, that Moshe hisig et nevuatav shel Bilaam mikoach atzmo, that Moshe comprehended the prophecy of Bilaam through his own strength, meaning to say that it was appropriate that this passage should be said by Bilaam, should be said by Moshe, but rather what he needed was necessary was that the prosecutor will turn to the defense. Meaning to say Moshe Rabbeinu could have said these things on his own, but the Torah wanted to make a specific point that the prosecuting prophet, i.e. Bilaam, would actually turn into the defense attorney. That's what the Shloah Kadosh is saying. Maybe we'll see it in depth in a little bit more depth. But first I want to cite the Rabbeinu Gershom, who lived in the 11th century. He writes as follows. Rabbeinu Gershom says, hold on one second. Rabbeinu Gershom writes, I just want to see here for a second if I have it actually on the page. Hold on. Okay, so I want to get the exact language. The Rabbeinu Gershom writes, he says, Afagav de Bilam Gufei Hava Navi. He says, no, the reason why he needs to mention that Moshe wrote it is because Bilam himself was himself a prophet. And so therefore, Bilam could have written this as his own book, just like there's a book of Ezekiel or Micah, Obadiah. It could have been a prophecy of Bilam and had no reason to be written by Moses. So therefore, it's telling us that even though Bilam could have written it, it was written by Moshe Rabbeinu. That's the explanation. So far, we've seen three explanations. Why does the Torah have to mention it was written by Moshe? Why does the Talmud need to say it was written by Moshe? The first was Rashi, because he says it wasn't necessary for the story, the narrative of the Jewish people. The second explanation is the explanation of the Shloah HaKadosh, that Moshe comprehended it on his own, even though it was said by Bilam, but Moshe could have said this prophecy on his own. And the third answer we just saw is Rabbeinu Gershom, who said that even though Bilam was a prophet, he could have written it in his own book. Nevertheless, Moshe Rabbeinu wrote it. A fourth explanation is from the Ritva, that this is the fourth. Jeffrey, are you trying to say something?
No.
Okay, fine. I'm just going to mute you because I'm hearing some background static.
No
So the fourth explanation is from the Ritva, and the Ritva writes that the intent is not to say this Talmudic text is not referring to the passage of Bilam that was written in the Torah, but rather it's a different passage that Moshe wrote and wrote at greater length. and they had it in the Talmud. This is a shocking explanation that there's a lost prophecy of Moses out there that's floating around that they had, which we don't have. That they had, that Moses wrote Bilam's prophecy at greater length, and we don't actually have that anymore. So there's a missing prophetic work of Moshe Rabbeinu.
I mean, there could be like a whole book.
There's a whole book that Moshe wrote that we don't have. That's what this is a reference to. Says the Ritva writing in 14th century Spain. Amazing, right? Moshe Rabbeinu wrote a whole work which we don't have. There are other references to lost works in the Torah itself. It says Sefer HaBrit. It says the Sefer Melchamot Hashem, the book of the wars. So there are other references to works that we don't have, but this is the Ritva saying there's a prophecy that we don't have. In the Sefer Torah Chaim, he writes that it doesn't mean that Rashi is not referring, when he says that the prophecy of Bilam was not necessary. You'll see at the end of the portion, I don't know if we'll get up to it today, it goes through, first he starts by saying three prophecies about the Jewish people, and it ends with the most famous one, Matovu Olecha Yaakov, Mishkanotecha Yisrael. And then Bilam goes on to give prophecies about the other nations of the world, not at all referring to the Jewish people. So he says that that's what Rashi is referring to, that for sure the prophecies about the Jewish people are relevant to the Torah, but he's talking about the fourth prophecy, and he says that where Bilam goes to the nations of the world and gives them advice, and that is similar to a certain degree, like Job, who was a prophet to the world, and so therefore that's the part that he's saying was not necessary. So we see basically 5 explanations. What are the 5 explanations? I'll just repeat them before we go on to see any others. But the 5 explanations, hold on one second. The 5 explanations, hold on one second. The 5 explanations are the explanations of Rashi that it wasn't necessary. That's why it says Moshe wrote it, because the rest of the Torah was necessary, so to speak. Second explanation is of the Shlah, who says that the prophecy was to make the point that Moshe, even though it was Bilam, Moshe was able to receive it on his own, to understand it on his own. Rabbeinu Gershom says that the idea was that even though Bilam himself was a prophet and he could have written it, Moshe still wrote it. The fourth was the Ritva's explanation, which says that no, it's referring to a lost work, basically, another prophetic work, that Moshe wrote the prophecy of Bilam at greater length. And then there's a 5th explanation, which is the Torah Chaim, saying it's referring to the last prophecies of Bilam, which were the prophecies of the nations of the world, which are less relevant to the text of the Torah. But we have other explanations for this. I want to just point out, we have also here the explanation of the Nachas Yaakov, who's the author of the Nesivos. We have the explanation of the Maharal, the chief rabbi of Prague. We have the explanation of the Darkei Moshe, who's the Ramah Moshe Isserlis. And we have the Jerusalem Talmud's explanation with the Maria Pnim. So I'll share these 4 remaining explanations, 4 other explanations. So the Nachas Yaakov, the author of the Nesivos, explains that Bilam, when he said his prophecies, did not say them to Balak in the language of the Torah, because Balak certainly didn't know Hebrew. So Balak didn't know how to speak Hebrew. So Bilam did not recite these prophecies to Balak in Hebrew. He recited whatever was their vernacular. But Moshe received a prophecy, and he received the same prophecy that Bilam received, which was in Hebrew. And so therefore Moshe wrote it, and he was able to understand all the prophecies that Bilam made, because every single jot of every letter has mountains and mountains of deep mystical ideas. So Moshe was able to transmit it in Hebrew, even though Bilam transmitted it to the world, not in the Hebrew language. Meaning to say that Moshe understood the full depth of Bilam's prophecy. So that's the explanation of the Nachlas Yaakov. The Maharal gives a different explanation, meaning to say, he says, no, it means something else. He says, we don't want you to think that you shouldn't think that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote this passage because Bilam said that, but he didn't agree that was that Bilam was going to be a prophet. So therefore it says he wrote the passage of Bilam to say that this is exactly what God said to Bilam. It's a little prophecy. Basically, he's supporting that this is indeed an accurate prophecy. So that's the seventh explanation. So we saw the sixth explanation with the Nesivos, which was to say that Moshe transmitted it in Hebrew, and the seventh is Moshe's basically approving of the prophecy, saying it's accurate. The Maharal gives another explanation. This is our eighth explanation, that we might have thought to say that even though the passage of Bilam was written in the Torah, we might have said, okay, it's not really the Torah, because the Torah is the Torah of Moshe, because the Torah is a prophecy of Moshe, not the prophecy of Bilam. So therefore it says that Moshe included this prophecy, meaning to tell us that the prophecy of Bilam, even though it's the prophecy of Bilam, is equivalent in holiness to the Torah and is considered like Torah. We might have thought, okay, this is just like an addition. It's not as holy as the prophecy of Moses. It's of lesser holy, by the way, which is what some scholars, not traditional scholars, not scholars who are part of the, so to speak, traditional Jewish community, they argue, oh, the prophecy of Deuteronomy is later. It's not as authoritative. It's a secondary author. So this is why it's telling us that even though this was said by a different author, this has the same level of holiness. That's the eighth explanation of the Maharal. We have a ninth explanation, and that is of the Darkei Moshe. And he explains on the basis of the Yerushalmi to Tractate Sota that Bilam, he tells us that Bilam was actually somebody else. That Bilam was one of the advisors to Job, Elihu. Elihu was one of the three friends of Job who came to comfort him, and that is actually Bilam. And why is he called Bilam? Because he came to curse the Israelites and in the end bless them. Meaning to say that, what does this verse mean? That Moshe wrote the book of Job and also the passage of Bilam that's mentioned in this book. And that is the passage of Elihu, which is the book of Job, because it says in the Gemara that Moshe wrote the book of Job. So that's what it says, that this is a reference to the Gemara and the Yerushalmi, that Bilam was one of the characters in the book of Job. And so therefore it's telling us that he wrote it because it's to tell us this. Why does it have to tell us he wrote it? Because it's in addition to the book of Job, there's an independent work about one of the characters of Job, and that's the prophecy of Bilam, which is included in the Torah. Do you follow that? Should I repeat that one again? Basically, what it says that Moshe wrote the Torah, he wrote the book of Job, and one of the characters in the book of Job is Elihu, one of the three friends of Job. And so it's telling us that Moshe didn't just write the book of Job, he also wrote the work, which is the prophecy of Elihu, which we included in the Torah as the passage of Bilam. And now the Yerushalmi tells it a little differently. And the Yerushalmi writes Moshe wrote the 5 books of the Torah, and then he went back and wrote the Parashas Balak Bilaam. That's what the Yerushalmi says to tractate Sota, chapter 5, halacha 6. And the Mari HaPanim explains that what this means is that first Moshe wrote the entire Torah, with the exception of the passage of Bilaam, and only after he finished this, he wrote the passage of Bilaam, meaning to say he wrote it later on. And that's what it means. So he didn't write it together with the Torah, but he wrote it after he had written the rest of the Torah. He wrote it later on. That's what this explanation is saying. So hold on one second. Okay, so let me just pause for a moment. If anybody has any questions about this, I'll take any questions.